Glad you could join us today on Earth File. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. The number of people facing acute food insecurity could nearly double this year to 265 million due to the economic fallout of COVID-19. That's according to the United Nations World Food Programme. This means more than a quarter of a billion people will suffer acute hunger by the end of the year. Sub-Saharan Africa, the world's largest rice importing region, could be heading from a health crisis straight into a food security crisis, the World Bank warns, while domestic crops go rotten amid lockdown measures. COVID-19 is seen as a multiplier of acute food insecurity that has already affected more than 5 million people in the country. Today, we start with how the pandemic is affecting rice producers in Benue State. Just stay with us. In Benue State, the food basket of Nigeria, Mercy sits in front of her idle rice mill. Demand is high across the country, but she already has mounts of paddy rice that are going nowhere amid the COVID-19 lockdown.
The rice, paddy rice I have in large quantity. I cannot mill because the marketers are not coming. They have stopped coming. When they start to come, I can mill everything here and they will buy.
Mercy is referring to wholesale buyers as she sat at a market store in the city of Makurdi with dozens of other millers. The United Nations says millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa are at risk of not getting the food they need due to virus disruptions. Although food truck drivers are meant to be exempt from lockdown restrictions, many are afraid for their own safety or fear they will be fined or arrested by overzealous police.
Before, if we carry load, reach here, with a carrier 65,000, highest you go spend 5,000 before you reach Abuja. Now you can spend almost 35,000 naira. Who go follow road now? Come Abuja, then block everywhere.
Trucking logistics firm Cobalt 360 said 30% of its fleet across Nigeria, Kenya, Togo, Ghana and Uganda has stopped working as a result.
There's no clarity around what can move around or what trucks can move around or what assets or what is essential transportation. So you see many of our transporters and truck owners are scared or because they're scared to go out and have their drivers on the road because they are worried that they're going to get held or detained because there's no clarity.
Several farmers said crops were rotting in the fields or at the depots waiting for trucks that never arrive. While domestic crops and capacity go to waste, the imports the region relies on have also dried up as major suppliers, including India, Vietnam and Cambodia, have reduced or even banned rice exports to make sure their countries have enough food to cope with the pandemic. Meanwhile, scarcity has driven up prices of main staple food beyond the reach of some people since lockdowns were announced in 3 states in Nigeria at the end of March to tame the spread of the virus.
This lockdown has affected food so much. Gari that we used to buy for 115 naira before is now between 900 and 1,000 naira. Big cup of rice that we used to buy for 315 naira is now 500 naira. Beans has moved from 120 to 170 naira. Things are more expensive now.
The Minister of Agriculture said the government is taking steps to make sure farmers, millers and marketers cooperate. But help cannot come soon enough for Mercy in Benue, who is awaiting the day marketers return.
We are having challenges of buying the rice now because of the lockdown. People are not moving. We don't have vehicles to go to the village. Normally we go to village markets to buy rice, but no, we don't move. We don't go out. And even the marketers, some come from Lagos to patronize me here, from Bayelsa, Port Harcourt. But because of the lockdown, they are not coming again. So we have poor markets.
The situation here in Makurdi is what the World Food Programme says is pushing the rate of hunger across the world. The COVID-19 pandemic could almost double the number of people suffering acute hunger globally, pushing it to more than a quarter of a billion by the end of this year.
This year report, the 2020 report, basically tells us that even before COVID-19, at the beginning of 2020, we already had a very large number of people in severe acute food insecurity. Actually, the largest ever number of people in severe acute food insecurity since we had the first edition of the report in 2017.
Global Report on Food Crisis 2020 says almost 5 million people suffered acute food insecurity in northern Nigeria in 2019. Nationally, 7% of children aged 6 to 59 months suffered from wasting, which is considered a medium prevalence. Of them, 1.5% were affected by severe wasting. The wasting prevalence in the 3 crisis-affected states was high in Benue State with 10.6% and medium in Yobe with 8.9%, while Adamawa has 7.1%. Persistent insecurity due to the 10-year-old Boko Haram insurgency is causing continuing misery and dangers for millions living in northern states. Climate change and a growing population is putting pressure on land, with growing tensions and violence between pastoralists and farmers, leading to a lack of investment and failure to maximize the country's vast agricultural potential. Levels of poverty, especially in the north, remain stubbornly high, with half the people in the country estimated to be living on less than $1.90 per day. Globally, the number of people facing acute food insecurity will rise to 265 million by the end of 2020. The impact of lost tourism revenues, falling remittances and travel and other restrictions linked to the coronavirus pandemic are expected to leave some 130 million more people acutely hungry this year, adding to around 135 million already in that category.
It is important to stress that these 135 million people who are already in situation of food crisis are already weakened. They are very fragile health. And it's clear that these people, they will be further affected by the impact, and therefore they need our continued support.
Yemen, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Afghanistan, Bolivian Republic of Venezuela, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Syria, the Sudan, Nigeria, and Haiti are the 10 countries which constituted the worst food crisis in 2019. These 10 countries accounted for 88 million people. South Sudan had 61% of its population in a state of food crisis or worse in 2019.
We are extremely worried about the displaced people, the IDPs, the refugees that are also very impacted. And then we are also very concerned by the fact that COVID-19 could create the conditions for social and political unrest in some of these contexts.
In December, the United Nations said it needed $270 million urgently to provide food to hungry South Sudanese in the first half of 2020 and avert mass starvation in South Sudan. The world's youngest country has been plagued by droughts in recent months and flooding, which have destroyed crops and livestock, leaving millions without food.
Nowhere else in the world has the level of food insecurity as South Sudan. Last year, we had to feed 5 million people due to fighting and flooding. Already in 2020, we've had locust invasions, and now there is the COVID-19 pandemic, which we predict could almost double the people in acute hunger by the end of 2020 across the world. The only way we can halt this trend is if generous funding for humanitarian crises like the one here in South Sudan continues.
Regional crises continue to see high levels of acute food insecurity, particularly in the Lake Chad Basin and Central Sahel. Africa has the largest numbers of acutely food insecure people in need of assistance in countries badly affected by weather events, particularly in the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa, followed by Central America and Pakistan. In East Africa, armed conflict, intercommunal violence, and other localized tensions continue to affect peace and security, particularly in South Sudan, and continues to maintain large refugee populations in neighboring countries such as Uganda.
WFP estimates that 20 million people are now food insecure in 9 countries in the region: Ethiopia, South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Djibouti, and Eritrea. We have done projection about the situation there, about the number of food insecure people. And this number is likely to increase to 34 million, up to 41 million during the next 3 months due to the socio-economic impact of COVID-19.
The report reflects the growing influence of economic crisis on acute food insecurity levels, particularly in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Haiti, and the Sudan. An estimated 79 million people remained displaced globally as of mid-2019. 44 million of them internally displaced and 20 million were refugees under the UNHCR's mandate. More than half of these refugees were hosted in countries with high numbers of acutely food insecure people. In countries where funding constraints have reduced assistance in refugee camps, refugees' food security was severely threatened. Civil war broke out in oil-producing South Sudan in 2013, less than 2 years after the country gained independence from Sudan following decades of war. The conflict that has killed an estimated 400,000 people and forced millions from their homes.
First, we think we need to continue, scale up, expand real-time, near real-time monitoring of the food security situation. We need to have a clear picture of what the impact of situation like COVID is so that we can trigger really early action. The second one, we need to preserve critical humanitarian food, livelihood, and nutrition assistance to vulnerable people. This is absolutely critical. Social protection is another area where we need to work. In the meantime, we need to make sure that in terms of access to food, that the food that is produced continues to flow to the market. We need to make sure that food processing continues, that transport and access to local markets is secured. And this includes advocating for trade corridors to basically remain open.
The novel coronavirus disease is having an unprecedented impact around the world, both in health and socio-economic terms. While COVID-19 does not discriminate, the 55 countries and territories that are home to 135 million acutely food insecure people in need of urgent humanitarian food and nutrition assistance are the most vulnerable to the consequences of this pandemic, as they have very limited or no capacity to cope with either the health or socio-economic aspect of the shock. These countries may face an excruciating trade-off between saving lives or livelihoods, or in a worst-case scenario, saving people from the coronavirus to have them die from hunger. Given the unprecedented nature of the crisis created by the pandemic, creating a better understanding of the potential impact of COVID-19 and taking rapid collective action to preempt its impact on food security and food systems are of paramount importance and urgency. Briefing the United Nations Security Council recently, World Food Programme Executive Director stressed that with COVID-19, we are not only facing a global health pandemic, but also a global humanitarian catastrophe.
Today with COVID-19, I want to stress that we're not only facing a global health pandemic, but also a global humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of civilians living in conflict-scarred nations, including many women and children, face being pushed to the brink of starvation with the specter of famine, a very real and dangerous possibility.
I thank Mr. Beasley for his briefing.
Via video link, the World Food Programme Executive Director warned the Council that while dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the world is also on the brink of a hunger pandemic. According to the WFP, 821 million people go to bed hungry every night all over the world, chronically hungry. And as the new global report on food crisis shows, there are a further 135 million people facing crisis levels of hunger or worse. This is a substantial rise over the last 4 years, Almost 60% of all those people in 2019 did so in context of conflict or instability.
Lockdowns, economic recessions are expected to lead to a major loss of income among the working poor. Overseas remittances will also drop sharply. This will hurt countries like Haiti, Nepal, and Somalia, just to name a couple. The loss of tourism receipts will damage countries like Ethiopia, where it accounts for 47% of its total exports. The collapsing oil prices in lower income countries like South Sudan will have an impact significantly, where oil accounts for 98.8% of total exports. And of course, when donor countries' revenues are down, how much impact will this have on life-saving foreign aid?
The executive director stated that there is also a real danger that more people could potentially die from the economic impact of COVID-19 than from the virus itself. Echoing the United Nations Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, Mr. Beasley urged the Council to lead the way to peace.
We need all parties involved in the conflicts to give us swift and unimpeded humanitarian access to all vulnerable communities so that we can get the assistance to them that they need, regardless of who they are or where they are. We also need, in a very general sense, humanitarian goods and commercial trade to continue flowing across the borders, because they are the lifeline of global food systems as well as the global economy. Supply chains have to keep moving if we are going to overcome this pandemic and get food from where it is produced to where it is needed.
I thank Mr. Beasley for
The Food and Agriculture Organization Director General also briefed the Council.
Conflict prevention acted earlier to reduce the impact of the conflict are highly effective steps that can be taken to avert and reduce acute food insecurity. And we need prevention as the forecast for food security in 2020 look bleak. Conflict, extreme weather, desert locust, economic shocks, and now the COVID-19 are likely to push more people into acute food insecurity. But by closely monitoring evaluation of this shock, we can rapidly intervene to mitigate their impact.
Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council urged the Security Council to avoid politicizing access to aid.
We urge the Security Council to avoid politicizing access to aid and rather by default enable us as humanitarian actors to provide relief wherever and whenever there are unmet needs across front lines, across borders, across political, religious and ethnic lines. There must be consequences when men with guns and power prevent children and families from accessing food through their harvest or through aid from us. The Security Council must ensure investigations and accountability through a mechanism to monitor and report on humanitarian access and starvation crimes. Only then will generals, commanders, and politicians think twice before they deny civilians food.
In Africa, the virus could take a significant toll on food production itself if it sickens the aging agricultural workforce or prevents women who produce 70% of Africa's food and are often tasked with caring for the elderly from getting to the fields. This comes even as Africa is on the verge of a food crisis faced with the locust invasion, the worst infestation in the last 25 years. In East Africa, a second locust invasion hit countries in the region as they battle COVID-19. In the 6 East African countries worst affected or at risk of locust, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda, and Tanzania, around 20 million people are already experiencing acute food insecurity. Widespread rainfall, which started in March, is expected to produce a dramatic increase in locust numbers in East Africa over the coming months, with new swarms expected to move from Kenya into South Sudan and Uganda.
And you find that every time you are trying to control in one region, there is another swarm that is happening in a different region, and it is not possible to control them simultaneously. because most of the time they are at different stages. So it requires a lot of personnel and capacity to be able to undertake all the control operation and also managing the surveillance in terms of the ground team.
In Kenya, the Food and Agriculture Organization is training farmers to use motorized sprayers to contain the locusts. Over 1 million hectares of land in East Africa have been surveyed for locusts and over 240,000 hectares treated with chemical pesticides or biopesticides. 740 people have been trained to conduct ground locust control operations. The outbreak of COVID-19 has had an impact on the supply of motorized sprayers and pesticides. Supply of pesticides has been delayed as global air freight has reduced significantly, and restrictions on the movement of personnel and equipment imposed by governments pose a challenge, particularly for small-scale farmers.
When you want to load an aeroplane early in the morning, there is also the restrictions of timing and also locating the swarms because of the curfew. However, we are trying to come up with innovative ways, like reducing the number of populations that are being met at once for the training, as well as also engaging the security officers so that they can allow a small extension of time for the locust scouts as well as the operation team.
The desert locust is considered the most destructive migratory pest in the world, and a single swarm covering 1 square kilometer can contain up to 80 million locusts.
The small-scale farmers, it's a very big problem, and for the food security of Kenya, especially after a problem like the coronavirus, how are we going to feed Kenya? All of our produce is for local consumption, and yeah, I think everyone needs to take this seriously and support everywhere you can, because it's a very big problem for Kenya as a whole.
As demand for food has increased in line with a burgeoning global population, the global food systems and the natural resources they rely on are already under strain. And in many places in the developing world, climate change impacts and vulnerability add extra pressure, threatening food systems, livelihoods, and health.
We hear a lot about how businesses are responsible for our food systems that are either broken or not pointing in the right direction or dysfunctional, and businesses are a big part of the problem. But governments don't realize how many levers they have and how influential they can be in changing the way their food system is set up. So a couple of examples. Most public sector agricultural R&D, research and development, is really focused on cereals. And that is entirely appropriate sort of 30 or 40 years ago, when filling bellies is the main objective, getting rid of hunger. Now, hunger is still a massive problem, and it's increasing in some parts of the world, including in Africa. But an even bigger problem is nourishing people, making sure people eat more of the right kinds of foods and less of the wrong kinds of foods. And so agricultural R&D should be much more skewed away from cereals towards fruits and vegetables, pulses, nuts, fish, eggs, dairy, the things that are too expensive in many African and Asian and European markets for people to consume. They're being priced out. Agricultural R&D, raising the productivity, is one way of lowering the price and making it more available. Another way that governments could get more nutritious food to their people is through public procurement. Many governments are massive purchasers of foods for schools, for hospitals, for the judicial system. Rather than just buy cereals, think about putting some pulses into that mix. That's a way of building the demand for pulses and then stimulating the supply.
The last decade has witnessed a growing momentum around transforming the way smallholder farmers manage land in sub-Saharan Africa. To help improve smallholder farming, governments and development partners are working to create the policies, financial mechanisms, technological innovations and market opportunities. While these efforts are crucial for improving productivity, they do not address the long-term sustainability and resilience of the smallholder production systems. This is particularly the case in the dry lands, where the threat of land and soil degradation, water scarcity, and loss of biodiversity looms large. But that's our program for the week. Thank you for watching. We hope to be back with you next week. And for your comments and questions, our inbox @file@channelstv.com remains open anytime, any day. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the rest of the team here in Lagos, do stay safe, and we'll see you next week.